Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, please turn off all electronic devices. Please refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, please turn off all electronic devices. Please refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Michael Medved.
Good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Thank you all for coming this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who defend and protect our freedoms around the world, if you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, there's a few people, special people in the audience I'd like to recognize. Michael's brother, Harry Medved, and Harry's family, including his wife, Michelle, and daughter, Aviva. I had the honor of introducing Michael when he was here last. It was just before Thanksgiving in 2016, 5 years ago. And I recently watched a replay of his appearance here for a number of reasons. Chief among them, I wanted to see the joy on Michael's face, and it was there, over the fact that the Reagan Library was the launch site of the tour for this book 5 years ago. At the time, Michael's 13th book, The American Miracle, had just been published. And when I say just been published, I really mean it. It was the first moment, I think, that Michael had the chance to see this brand new book in print. If you've ever written a book, like I have, and torn open the box to see the book's bright, shiny new cover for the first time, right when it's hitting the store shelves, well, it is a special feeling. And it's that feeling that I am sure Michael has had with each and every one of his 14 now terrific books. In fact, as I was preparing for this introduction of Michael and reviewing his many accomplishments, I have to tell you, I was just stunned to uncover the remarkable similarities between our life stories. For example, Michael has written several New York Times best-selling books, and I have written a couple of books. Michael has been a nationally syndicated movie reviewer for many years, and I have seen many movies. Michael has been a nationally syndicated radio talk show host for many years with a weekly audience of nearly 5 million listeners. And I have listened to the radio probably millions of times over the years. But the valid comparisons between our lives do not stop there. As a young man, Michael once hitchhiked across the nation from coast to coast in what simply has to be world record time, 3 days. He must have had a very friendly face. I, too, have hitchhiked across America right after graduating from high school. And yes, you guessed it, with this face, it took me 3 months. On a far, far more serious note, in the middle of the last decade, it took Michael 4 months to beat stage 3 throat cancer and become cancer-free. Well, some of you will be pleased to know that while it took me 5 years to kick cancer, just 2 days ago, my own doctor reported that I too am now cancer-free. One final valid comparison between the two of us can be made. Both of us learned in the fight against cancer, and I'm quoting Michael, that family isn't everything, it's the only thing. When Michael was here in 2016, I learned from him that his book, The American Miracle, was actually the first in a series, or at least I hope will continue as a series, about divine providence in America. Of the many topics that Michael's written about over the years, it's a personal favorite of mine for reasons that involve a far, far more legitimate comparison between two men, Ronald Reagan and Michael Medved. Indeed, our 40th president and Michael have an uncanny resemblance to one another when it comes to their outlook on life, and in particular, an outlook on America and present times, notwithstanding its very future. You need read no further than page 1 of Michael's newest book, God's Hand on America, to know that he and Ronald Reagan share a belief that America has a rendezvous with destiny. Truth be known, they both profess that events in our nation's history have unfolded according to a master plan, guided and administered by a force of divine providence. To quote President Reagan, God, in shedding his grace on this country, has always, in this divine scheme of things, kept an eye on our land and guided it as a promised land. Well, if these words ring true to you today, even as we suffer the present division in our nation, then like me, you are going to love Michael's newest book. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library, Mr. Michael Medved.
And what a blessed occasion. John, I am so pleased that the Almighty has answered prayers of literally thousands of people who I know wished you the best. And I want to tell you something else about comparisons. The books that you've written successful novels. I am a very frustrated novelist. I wrote my first novel in 8th grade, and it wasn't very good. But then I went through like 3 different successful novels. I invested 2 years and got a master's degree, Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing, which is almost entirely worthless, but I had a creative writing professor, my thesis advisor, who said, you should be writing nonfiction. And that was advice that was worth a great deal. That was very important advice. I want to talk a little bit about the divisions in the country right now that seem to be so painful. I mean, some of it's almost humorous. It's so overblown. The President of the United States yesterday said in his speech in Philadelphia at the Constitution Center in Philadelphia, President Biden said that we are experiencing the most serious threat to democracy since the Civil War. And he even made the point that the Confederates never stormed the Capitol building. Well, they tried, you know, I mean, that was not, okay. This idea that dispute about whether or not they're going to have midnight voting in Texas is something that is going to break apart our country, that is not what is going on here. The key issue that I think is so painfully separating different perspectives in America today is our children. And it's a very profound aspect of our children. What are we going to tell them about their country? Are we going to tell them that their country is corrupt and racist and oppressive and guilty, guilty, guilty? Or are we going to say, America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crowned thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea? And all of this division over whether it should be the purpose of our education system, it should be the purpose of our parenting to instill guilt or gratitude, that purpose depends on how you answer a fundamental question. And it's a crucial question. It's one of the things that inspired me to write American Miracle and God's Hand on America. There's a historian who just retired recently from University of Pennsylvania named Walter McDougall. And he asked a great question. He said, try to imagine, like they do in science fiction movies, that there's a time traveler who starts out in 1600. And all of a sudden, he is brought forward to 2021. Is there parts of the world he would recognize? Sure. A lot of the same countries, a lot of them have the same characteristics. Russia is a menacing empire that underperforms classically. France is an arrogant country that thinks, for reasons known only to itself, that it's better than everybody else. You have a world in South America, which at the time is dominated by some very advanced Indian civilizations that are constantly making war on each other and can't seem to figure out a workable system of governments. You have the Islamic world, which is both extremely impressive and very dangerous to the West, et cetera, et cetera. The one thing you could not imagine, time traveler from 1600, is the United States of America. It is preposterous to think that someone in 1600, when asked, okay, where are we going to find 500 years from now? Where are we going to find 400 years and change from now? Where are we going to find the most powerful, the dominant civilization on the planet? The militarily most powerful, the economically most powerful, and yes, the most powerful in terms of influence and culture and leading the whole world. He could not have conceived that that would be found in North America. More likely in any of those other places that I named. And this is one of the problems that we have in terms of how you teach history. America is such a shock. It is so illogical. On what basis would you think in 1600 that all of a sudden the power and the prosperity would be localized here in the North American continent, which, yes, was underpopulated in 1600, and there were no great cities. The biggest city that existed in North America under Indian times was in the Hopewell civilization, which vanished. They had a city called Cahokia near St. Louis in the Illinois side that reached 25,000, but then it went away, and no one knows why that civilization disappeared. It disappeared by the year 1200. Okay. So here's the question. Why did America rise so shockingly, so surprisingly, with so many lucky breaks? You have basically three possible explanations. The most unsatisfying explanation is the one that people usually use, which is that America rose through a combination of happy accidents. There was a pattern of happy accidents. We had a lot of accidents with geography, then a lot of different accidents happened in our history. I write about some of them. And the one thing that people don't acknowledge, and the reason that that is an unsatisfying explanation for America's rise, is that a pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern. You don't all of a sudden win a straight flush in playing poker 9 times in a row without thinking, wait a minute, somebody's rigging this game. The game has been rigged in America's favor in a shocking way from the very onset of early settlement. So, okay, that's one explanation. The other explanation, the one that is most popular in academia today, is America rose because America was an evil, rapacious, ruthless, cruel, oppressive country that despoiled Indian civilizations and the peaceful and harmonic and paradisal world that the Native Americans inhabited, and because America set up this evil institution of slavery. I hate, by the way, when people call slavery our original sin, because that implies that we originated it. It was already a sin of more than 5,000 years' duration at the time that America took it up. And if you actually look at that's another story, but that's part of what is exactly involved with so-called critical race culture and the debates we're having today. In other words, the idea of the 1619 Project is not just that America participated in this great and monumental wrong, this cruel and evil institution. It's that America originated upon it, and that sin, that sinful system, originated America. The idea that America was based upon slavery. By the way, slavery exists in terms of kidnapping people in Africa and bringing them to the New World. It existed for more than 100 years and had already captured and kidnapped and sent across the Atlantic more than 3 million human beings by the time that fateful 1619 encounter occurred with the first 23 slaves, who, by the way, most historians would agree, including Henry Louis Gates of Harvard, that those slaves, probably the majority of them, worked as indentured servants and were freed later in life. But leave that aside. The basic choice that has become most popular right now for explaining America's power and prosperity and shocking growth is that it comes because America was uniquely evil. There's only one other alternative. It's either just happy accidents, it's America was uniquely evil and rapacious, or America was uniquely blessed. That America has had things working for us in some kind of supernatural way from the very beginning. I know what the founders believed. All of them, including people who were religious nonconformists like Benjamin Franklin, like Thomas Jefferson, like Alexander Hamilton, all of these human beings looked at the world around them, looked at the way that events played out around them, and they understood it was the third alternative. And that's the reason that's what we are arguing about basically when we are talking about grief, gripe, guilt, or gratitude. And one of the ways to encourage gratitude is to remember where thanks are due. So that's the basic point about this book. Let me tell you 3 stories from God's Hand on America, and I'll try to tell them quickly. They're all remarkable. They all fit together, and they all make it clear why so many people, and by the way, including even Barack Obama belatedly, including Franklin Roosevelt, who himself was, as one of the stories in my book shows, clearly the beneficiary of some kind of truly spooky divine protection. And he recognized it, and America recognized it. Very quickly on that one of the things that made Ronald Reagan believe that he had a special mission from God was his escape by the narrowest of margins of assassination in 1981, just weeks after he became president. He hadn't won the Cold War, he hadn't turned America around, he hadn't built back America's spirit, he hadn't renewed the economy. And he came within about 1/4 of an inch of death. Okay? And he believed and knew that this meant that his life was on loan from God. Here's the fascinating thing. 6 weeks later, the other figure most important in winning the Cold War, who was Pope John Paul II, another old man, gets another bullet in the gut and somehow survives against all odds. And Reagan actually used several times the term "my best friend" to describe the Holy Father, now Saint John Paul II. But in any event, right before that happened, not right before, but in 1933 and 1932 at Christmas time, there was a combination of near-death experiences for both Franklin Roosevelt, who also came extraordinarily close as president-elect to being assassinated, and Winston Churchill. And it was only a few months that separated these two incidents. I describe them in the book under the chapter Two Close Calls. And Roosevelt was almost shot by a crazed assassin who shot off 6 bullets. He killed the mayor of Chicago, Tony Chermak. 3 other people were wounded. Roosevelt, who couldn't move because he had polio, remember, he's sitting in the back of the car. It's an open car. The bullets barely missed him. And it changed Roosevelt's life and character to know that. Churchill, a few months before, he was not in government. It was his wilderness years. He was making a living as a writer, and he came to America to do a series of lectures. He's a pretty good talker, Winston Churchill. And by the way, he also was a great lover of America. His mother was American. She was a Brooklyn girl. No, she really was, Jenny Jerome. And so Churchill is in New York. He's going over to get something to drink, which was very frustrating because this is still prohibition in the United States. Churchill didn't like prohibition. He was not a supporter. And so it's Christmas season, and he's going out to the home of Bernard Baruch, which is on Park Avenue in New York, and he forgot the address. And he's trying to find a place to go. And he thinks he sees the place. He tells the driver, he's taking a cab, let me off here. And he forgets that they drive the other direction in America. Steps into the street, a speeding car hits him, and it's documented, it hits him at 35 miles an hour. And he wrote about this repeatedly. He said, for some reason, my head wasn't squashed like an egg. But his feet were both broken. And again, you have 2 great men who were spared. Happy accidents. Okay. Now the first real story that changed the world and won the Cold War. You can come home from this and you can tell I heard Michael Medved, and he said this crazy thing, how Lincoln's Secretary of State won the Cold War. Well, he really did. And I'll tell you who says so. Vladimir Putin. And you know you can trust him when it comes to who won the Cold War. Okay, it goes like this. The worst night in American history was arguably a night in April of 1865 when Abraham Lincoln was killed. And this is the only president we ever had who was killed as part of a genuine conspiracy. There was also a plan to kill the vice president, Andrew Johnson, and a plan to kill the Secretary of State, William Henry Seward. The Secretary of State was a particularly easy target for Booth and his Confederates, and they were his Confederates in every way. I'll tell you why, because he had 9 days before the assassination. In other words, before the final Union victory in the Civil War, the surrender at Appomattox, which was, again, you think God doesn't have a plan? Do you know what day in the Christian calendar Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox? It was Palm Sunday. And what day was Lincoln killed? Good Friday. Right. And no one could miss it because it's the same progression. In any event, on that Good Friday, Seward was upstairs in his house, which was across from the White House. They called it the Old Clubhouse. And he was a veteran politician. He was a crusader against slavery. He and his wife actually were part of the Underground Railroad, helping escape slaves, even when he was governor of New York and senator from New York. He was a remarkable man, brilliant man as well. And he became Lincoln's closest friend, despite the fact that they had been rivals for the Republican nomination. In any event, Seward is out taking a carriage ride with his son and his daughter. The horses run wild. The driver who had stopped could not get control of the horses, and he fell aside. So Seward is stepping out of the coach to try to grab control of the horses because they're barreling down the Washington Street. He falls out of the carriage, He breaks his jaw. He breaks 5 ribs. He is close to death. He is carried up back to the carriage house. And what they did for Seward is the doctors got to him, and they immediately put an iron plate around his jaw and strapped it around his face with canvas. And Lincoln came over and to see him immediately, and to wish that, sat at the edge of the bed, said, "God has spared you because your country needs you." And in any event, just 9 days later, Lincoln would have taken him to Ford's Theater, but of course Seward could not eat. He could not really drink anything because of the situation with his jaw and his arm. And by the way, what had happened with the assassination attempt is someone had broken into a sick room. Lewis Powell, who was a giant at the time, he was about Lincoln's height, 6'4", he's a huge guy. And what he did was he took a gun, and Seward's son, Frederick, who was Assistant Secretary of State, a little bit of nepotism, his son, Frederick, fought with Lewis Powell, who fired a pistol directly at his face. Pistol misfired. He took the pistol and broke it over Frederick's head. Frederick was in a coma for 2 months. He survived. And then Powell went into the bedroom where Seward was, and he took his Bowie knife and he plunged it toward the jugular of the Secretary of State 4 times. And on the 4th time, the knife broke. Why? Because it was hitting exactly the plate that had been put around his neck to allow his broken jaw to heal. Now, why is this important, and how does this win the Cold War? It's a tragic story. Seward loses his best friend. He is permanently wounded. You can see in the photographs that exist of Seward some of the knife wounds in his cheek. But he went on to continue as Secretary of State, and it is literally only because of this one individual that the United States of America, for a pittance, for less than a half a penny an acre, bought what was called Russian America, which was later given, and Seward helped give it the name, Alaska. Okay, this is all so remarkable and so unlikely. It was, people have heard the term Seward's folly. Horace Greeley, leading Republican editor, made the point that they call this Russian America. It's actually, we can call it Walrussia. There are only walruses who can live there. This should be of no interest to the United States. Seward was able to push this through. It got ratified, the treaty, by the Senate by a very narrow margin. There's even accusations of bribery to have it happen. In any event, Seward was the one man who made it happen, while the new president, Andrew Johnson, who had succeeded Lincoln, is facing his own impeachment crisis and is incapable of doing anything. I was put onto this whole story in 2017. In 2017, Russia, the new Russian Empire, the Russia of Vladimir Putin, had big commemorations of the dark day when the Americans cheated us of our inheritance in Alaska. And Putin commissioned a poem that was written about the day that Russia lost its empire. And that day, that was held to be that day. And when you think about it, can you realize what happened when we had missiles in Cuba in 1963? Imagine if we had missiles in Juneau. Now, I'm a little bit sensitive to that because we live in Seattle, and Russian missiles generally don't give you any kinds of reassurance, but Russian missiles in Juneau would have been horrible. And by this extraordinary story, and there are all kinds of details you can read, Seward's survival changed the map of America and gave us this huge tract of territory and a whole different position in terms of commanding the North Pacific. Very important. But even more important, perhaps, something not noted at the time, not noted really, I don't think, until my book. And I was going over some of the records in the State Department for the rest of Seward's term. And he added a bunch of other territories to America on his own because the president was busy with fighting impeachment and fighting the Republicans. He was actually a Democrat who had been picked by Lincoln with that choice. In any event, literally a month after securing the addition of Alaska to the United States, he found something from 1857. It was actually a piece of legislation he had voted on called the 1857 Guano Act. People know what guano is? It's bird poop. And at the time, it was very valuable to the United States of America. Why? For farmers. And Congress passed a bill that said if any of our sea captains who are going far and wide for the United States, and this is before the Civil War, find islands that are good repositories of guano, and no one else has claimed them, they can claim them for the United States. And Seward saw that there was an atoll of just 3 islands. There were 3 little islands that totaled a total of 2 square miles. So this is kind of the opposite from Alaska. And Seward, without checking with the president on his own initiative, he wasn't supposed to do that, but he did it. He filed the papers, wrote it down, that he was going to add what had already become known as the Midway Atoll to American territory. These are 3 little specks, fly specks of islands in the middle of the Pacific. They're called Midway precisely because they're half the distance between San Francisco and Tokyo. And the fate of the world was decided there. This is the second of the 3 stories that I wanted to share with you. And it's so extraordinary because if you read about the history of the Battle of Midway, which occurred in June of 1942, 6 months exactly almost after Pearl Harbor. And the American victory at Midway is one of the most shocking, illogical stories imaginable. The Japanese had sunk our most prominent vessels. They came into the Battle of Midway with 4 top-flight aircraft carriers. We came at them with 3 aircraft carriers, one of which had almost been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea. By all standards of naval warfare, the United States should have been wiped out at Midway. We found out where the Japanese were going. They were going to Midway because they were planning a 2-pronged attack on Alaska, which they did bring off, and Hawaii to occupy both. And what happened was in 4 minutes, some people say 5 minutes, so I call it the 5-minute miracle in my book. But the first books written about Midway were Miracle at Midway. There's a book by one of the commanders who survived the battle, God Was at Midway. And basically what happened, without getting into excruciating detail, but I find the detail utterly fascinating, is you had squadrons from these 3 different aircraft carriers that are trying to figure out where this huge Japanese fleet is that was the largest naval fleet ever assembled up to that time for the invasion of the Hawaiian home islands and the west coast of the United States. And they are looking over open ocean. They're about 150 miles away, and the planes have limited fuel capacity. And they couldn't find the Japanese fleet. And one of the pilots who was flying one of the American planes, looked down, and he thought he saw an arrow pointing in the waves. It was actually the wake of a sort of stray Japanese destroyer that was making its way back to join the main fleet. He turned in that way, hoping that his comrades from the other carriers would find him. And through sheerest coincidence, one of those happy accidents, all of a sudden, these 3 different squadrons of planes flying from different directions spot each other, see each other, head for the Japanese fleet. And believe it or not, in the course of less than 5 minutes, they dive bomb all of the carriers, successfully sink them. Nothing had happened like this in the history of the Navy before. And if Seward has not seen this little thing under the Guano Act of 1857 and initialed it, if we had not taken our Midway property, and by the way, anyone ever here been to Midway Atoll? It's a godforsaken place. It is desolate. It's like a movie, The Martians. There's really nothing there except bird poop and the seeds of American victory. And Chester Nimitz, who was the commander in the Pacific, said there's no rational explanation for this victory. One of the Japanese commanders who was there at Midway, and this is another one of those stories that every American should know, is named Matsuo Fushida. Has anyone ever heard of him? No. Okay, Matsuo Fushida is most famous because, if you remember the movie Tora, 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 that was the signal the Japanese used to launch their attack on Pearl Harbor. The man who said Tora, Tora, Tora was Matsuo Fushida. He was considered the best pilot in the Japanese Imperial Navy, an absolutely crack pirate. He was pilot. He was actually a seventh-generation samurai nobleman, and he was supposed to lead the Japanese planes on the day of the Battle of Midway. He had appendicitis the day before. He still wanted to fly. The doctors wouldn't let him fly. So he stayed on the deck of a carrier that was sunk, barely escaped the sinking, saw everything that happened, and immediately said, "This is not natural. Something very strange is happening here." After the war, he had some contact with American missionaries who were remarkable in forgiving some of the Japanese who tormented them in prison camps during the war. He became a Christian. He became an American. And he spent the last years of his life teaching, basically teaching Bible. He became a scholar. He appeared 9 times with Billy Graham. And Billy Graham helped to christen him, and I guess that's the right word, God's Samurai. And later he did a little autobiography called God's Samurai about how he came to believe in America first and then later in Christianity. Said no one who was there on that day could not see that God was on the side of that American victory. Okay, one more story, and it's one of those stories that is so remarkable. I was talking today a little bit about one of the things about America is that whatever your ancestry is, whatever your country your grandparents or great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents came from. My wife's family came from Germany at the time of the gold rush, right after the German revolutions of 1848, to California. But basically, every family, and I'm sure that's true for people here, you may have had people who were behind in Germany or Italy or Ireland or Poland or anywhere who made it to America and actually succeeded and achieved happiness and blessings beyond their dreams. Every American family feels that. I mean, my grandfather, my father's father, was a barrel maker from Ukraine. Never had a chance to go to school. He was a bright guy. But again, what has blessed us here is so remarkable. And I wanted to talk about what is probably the most controversial chapter in the new book. It's called The Abrahamic Advantage. And what this goes to is for Jewish people like us, my family and myself, in particular, it is so stunning Jewish people have lived all around the world. There is nowhere where Jewish people have been able to succeed and have been so welcomed as the United States of America. And this goes back to some statements, early statements by presidents. John Adams was I saw on the wall here at some point. John Adams in 1816 wrote to this crackpot named Mordecai Manuel Noah and said, "I visualize you someday marching at the head of a Judean army to redeem control of the land of your people. And it should be the job of the United States of America to do whatever we can to help that view." There was a whole point of view that began before America began. It began with people like William Bradford, who was a governor of Plymouth Colony, that basically America would succeed by following a very famous biblical passage. It's in Genesis 12:3. It was quoted by many of our founding fathers, where God says to Abraham, "Those who bless your seed will be blessed, and those who curse your seed will be cursed." Our founders believed that, and I mentioned this Mordecai Manuel Noah. He had dreams of, he believed, I think mistakenly, that the Native Americans were the lost 10 tribes. And he had this idea of building a refuge for them in a big island, which he bought in the middle of the Niagara River, and calling it Ararat. Get it? His name was Noah and Ararat. So basically, he was supported by leading and prominent Americans. He was a prominent Democratic politician in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. In any event, and John Adams supported the idea that he should march into Judea. There was a writer, distant relation, named George Bush, distant relation, who published a novel called Valleys of the Vision. And it was his vision of a future. It came out in 1848. And his vision of the future was that 100 years from now, America is going to use, in part, flying machines to help the Jews back to Israel to reestablish a homeland. Now, this kind of thing, there's a cartoon that appeared in 1881. The Tsar is assassinated. There's all kinds of persecution of the largest Jewish community in the world in Russia. Terrible persecution, and you have, for the first time, at the time of the dispersion, there are 2 million Russian Jews. And they don't go all over the world. Some did, but overwhelmingly 90% of them came here. And Emma Lazarus also became someone who was very much American poet and very much American patriot. And when you read about her work, to believe in linking the destiny of the United States to the destiny of a reborn Jewish nation in Israel, it's all remarkable, and it's haunting. And also haunting to me is at the same time that Harry Truman actually went against his cabinet to recognize the newly declared state of Israel on May 15th, 1948. He did it, he said, in part because of what he had learned at Baptist camp in Missouri when he was a little boy, where we sang songs about bringing the Jews home to Jerusalem. In any event, he also, right after his presidency, and he left the presidency in 1953, he's giving a presentation to United Jewish Appeal in New York. It's actually being held at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the upper west side of New York City. And he's being introduced by his old friend, former business partner, Eddie Jacobson. They had a failed tie store, haberdashery store in Independence, Missouri. And Eddie is getting up there, he's saying, and it's because of President Truman. I mean, he contributed so much. He was such an important force in the reestablishment of our ancient dream of reestablishing a newly reborn state of Israel. And then Truman gets up, everybody's standing ovation. He said, "Eddie, very nice introduction. What do you mean I was an important part?" And then he says, and he shouts, and you can hear it, it's recorded. It's Truman saying, "I am Cyrus! I am Cyrus! meaning he is like the Persian emperor who, after the Babylonian exile, allowed the Jews to return to our homeland. It's all remarkable. Okay, let me share one last thing with you, and it's again, this is honestly a passage that every American school child should know. At the beginning of the Cold War, when people were finally realizing what a tremendous danger Stalin was, how evil the Soviet Union was, and of course President Reagan, to his eternal credit, rightly labeled the Russian Empire as an evil empire, which it was. There's a diplomat in 1946, right after FDR's death, who sends a long telegram back to the Secretary of State, George C. Marshall, and Harry Truman. That long telegram by George Kennan says that America has an obligation, a sacred obligation, to contain communism. Change the world. That long telegram ends this way. The issue of Soviet-American relations is in essence a test of the overall worth of the United States as a nation among nations. Surely there was never a fairer test of national quality than this one. In the light of these circumstances, the thoughtful observer of Russian-American relations will find no cause for complaint in the Kremlin's challenge to American society. He will rather experience a certain gratitude to a providence which, by providing the American people with this implacable challenge, has made their entire security as a nation dependent on their pulling themselves together and accepting the responsibilities of moral and political leadership that history plainly intended them to bear. 1946. Reagan read this. Reagan understood it to the roots of his soul. It is not a burden to have the responsibility of redeeming the world. In fact, that's the point. We aren't blessed. We don't have all these happy accidents because we're better than anybody else. It's because we are an indispensable part of a plan for the uplift of humanity. Dr. King said, "The arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice." And that is exactly what the United States is involved in. President Reagan didn't shirk the idea that America had special responsibilities. We have special responsibilities because Lincoln described us as this almost chosen people. Chosen not for special rewards, but chosen for special responsibilities, which is one of the things that is so striking today at a time when there is so much turmoil and suffering in Cuba and in Haiti and in South Africa and around the world right now. And the United States cannot become absorbed with guilt or re-examining our history or talking about mistakes that have been made or crimes that have been committed or failures that have occurred. The truth of the matter is we need to consider not just our prospects, but we need to consider our progress, which has been remarkable in moving toward justice in every sphere. May that continue, because this choice between guilt and gratitude, it's not only about what makes us a better nation, it's about what makes us better people. If you are going to feel guilty and apologetic and ashamed and harp constantly on failures and disappointments, you're going to be miserable to live with. You're not going to have a happy life. You're not going to have a happy marriage, for God's sake. If you are grateful and you understand, as George Kennan did in 1946, that the United States must be grateful for the responsibilities that we have, then you can acknowledge God's hand on America, and certainly acknowledge, as I try to do every day in my work, that we remain indeed the greatest nation on God's green earth. And again, not as some kind of reward, but as some kind of responsibility. And the work ahead, people have used the phrase before for various politicians. He's the happy warrior. They said that about Al Smith. They said that about Franklin Roosevelt himself. They've said that about a number of politicians over the years. We should be all happy warriors in behalf of American gratitude and greatness. Thank you very much, and I hope we have time for some questions. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, just terrific, Michael. Thank you so much. We have a few minutes for some questions from the audience, and if you raise your hand, you have your question, but we'll bring a microphone to you so everyone can hear your question. We'll start right over here.
Good evening, Michael. Lovely to see you this evening.
Thank you.
I have a question, and I have two questions. The one question is, if Nikki Haley had to stand for election, would you support her?
If Nikki Haley would, I am impressed by Nikki Haley. I think that Nikki Haley is whether she is president or not, I don't know. But I do know I think she's going to be an important leader in the nation's future.
My second question is about Black Lives Matter, and my third one is about critical race theory. And I think one's got to be very careful what one wishes for in life. I do come from South Africa.
Right. By the way, the stories from South Africa have made me look a little bit at the 9 years of rule under President Zuma, which probably was not the happiest time for people to live in South Africa. In terms of Black Lives Matter, the whole idea, the reason that I found it difficult to feel any deep alignment or sympathy with the Black Lives Matter movement is because they refuse to say all lives matter. You can say Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, but they wouldn't do that. And people got in trouble. People lost their jobs for saying all lives matter, which is absurd. And the one thing that is most astonishing to me, and I talked about this on the air today briefly, but I have a lot more detail on it. I'll probably talk about it tomorrow on the radio show. There's right now a new UN commission from the UN Human Rights Commission. They're going to spend 3 years looking for global evidence of crimes by police authorities in multiple nations all around the world against people of African descent. And the idea that if you look at some of the crime rates around the world, the United States by no means has the worst crime rates in the world. Russia has a terrible crime problem. Frankly, a number of the Netherlands has a terrible crime problem now. And of course, the nations of Latin America, I think Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world. And gang warfare and people dying. And if you look at the percentage of those deaths, of those horrors that are caused by police, it's very low percentage. And this is the idea that to focus on certain victims because they advance a political agenda, rather than talking about the generalized problem, it is at least, no, it's an unimaginable difference. The Washington Post does a tabulation every year of the number of African-American males unarmed who were killed in encounters with police officers, and it's too high. Last year it was 12, not 1,200, 12 individuals. And there are at least every year, 5,000 black victims of homicide, of murders by civilians. And I think the idea of attempting to blame police for problems which it is their job to try to mitigate is wrong.
I think we're over here.
Thank you very much for a wonderful speech. It was just marvelous. Let's go back to the moment in time when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. And President Trump was on an airplane, and when he deplaned, he was met by all these journalists, and one of them asked him, did he know that Ruth Bader Ginsburg had just passed away? And it was a moment when our president was caught off guard. He didn't know yet. And for me, I remember getting this feeling, and it was overwhelming to watch it, because we could feel a pivot occurring in our culture for the Supreme Court. And I wonder, are you going to detail that story? Because that, to me, is a very significant event.
Look, one of the things that I do in the book is, and I explain it, I don't talk about very recent events because we don't know what they mean. It takes a while for the last event that I talk about in the book is the Robert Kennedy assassination. And partially because I was there, and it was certainly one of the most impacting events of my life. When I was a junior in college, I took a semester off to work in the Kennedy campaign. And I was there at the Ambassador Hotel when he was shot. Now, that was 50 years ago. It's 53 years ago now. And I'm still not sure what that means. Because there's so much else that flowed from it. One thing that I do think about that assassination, and I think it's very, very tough to, people ask all the time, and it's one of the most common questions I've gotten regarding these books, is do you believe that Trump's election was a special blessing to save America? Because no one expected it, it was out of the blue. Or do you think that Trump's election was a special punishment for America? Now, there are serious people who've argued on both sides. At the time that President Trump was in the middle of his term, about 25% of people in a Fox poll thought that he had been placed in that position by God. I think you can make the case that every president is placed there by God if you believe that God is a master of events and controls everything. But honestly, I think for very recent times, I think it's one of the reasons that I've always avoided and opposed the idea that, you may remember there are lots of people who said Barack Obama is the worst president we've ever had. Well, the big argument against that is he got reelected, and worst president candidates don't. And for people to make that conclusion or lead to that conclusion about President Trump while his career is still very much in flux, I think is wrong. And I resist the idea of jumping to conclusions about which side the Almighty is on. After the fact. There's a passage in the book of Exodus where Moses wants to see God's face. And he's been working with a guy for a long time, and he figures, I really should get a shot to see what you look like. And God says, no man can see my face. He puts Moses in a cleft of the rock, and he hides his eyes. He said, you can see me as I pass. And what I've always understood that to mean, and there's a lot of traditional Jewish interpretation of that passage, is that you can't necessarily see God as he's coming at you. But after the fact, when God has passed, when history has unfolded a little bit, you can maybe see God was in that. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Germany, once said, it is the job of the statesman to listen for God's footsteps in history and then to grab his coattails and hang on. I think that's good advice. 2 more questions?
Yeah.
Great. Over here?
Yep.
Michael, wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank
My
you.
name's Kevin McNamee. I'm from Thousand Oaks, and my concern is regarding an educational system that has moved into critical race theory. In the critical race theory, they're making victims instead of victors out of our middle school, elementary school, and high school students. What is your thoughts on changing the direction of our educational system here in the United States that's corrupting the hearts and minds of our students?
Look, there is one change that is so necessary for all the problems in American education, and I hate to say it's one of those simple solutions. Mencken said for every great problem, there's a solution that is simple, elegant, and wrong. But this is a solution that's right. It's called school choice. Okay? School choice lets you choose. In other words, if you want to send your kids to school and turn them into neurotics and failures and encourage them with the belief that America is a country where nobody gets a fair chance, nobody can succeed, we are all victims of vicious capitalist heteronormative patriarchy and all the rest of the buzzwords. If you want that kind of school for your child, go ahead. You'll have very low enrollment. There are not many parents who would choose it, I don't think, not for themselves. And if you want to go to a school that teaches these very important books, or the truth about America and what a blessing America is, and how it, one of the things I do in my book is I quote one of the great Jewish leaders of all time, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who said that America is a malchus shel chesed, which means a kingdom of kindness. And America has played that role for generations, and that needs to be taught. Again, I think we have to be careful about using the term critical race theory because it's more than that. The 1619 Project is not exactly critical race theory, but it has the same impact. It's basically teaching children that their own country is evil. There's no nation in the world that's ever done that. That their own country is flawed, sure, but to recognize the unbelievable progress that we made. This is the one thing that's so amazing to me about this development. It's so bizarre, and it has no relationship to anything. Does anybody remember the night Barack Obama was elected in 2008, November 5th, 2008? There were 200,000, 300,000 people in Grant Park in Chicago who were just applauding this miracle, and everyone had to be moved by it. For a people who have been victimized by prejudice and by discrimination and by oppression and by slavery and all of that, you're electing a president of the United States. Nobody ever thought it possible. There's a best-selling novel called The Man, which came out in the 1960s, which was considered science fiction about a black president. What a thing! And it happened in America. And I would have thought that it would put to rest a great deal, and for a while people did think that race relations were better, and I think that President Obama missed a lot of opportunities to make progress in this regard. But I do believe that if those of us who are of a more patriotic bent counter any demands for stressing American guilt and American exploitation and racism, counter those demands by saying school choice. Because if you believe, why should people not have the same choice just because they lack the resources to pay private school tuition? And something like that, by the way, in Israel, where the education system is pretty good, they have complete school choice. Harry and I have 3 nephews and a niece, all educated in an excellent Israeli educational system, through school choice. They chose to go to a religious school. Other people chose to go to communist schools. There are people who go to Islamic schools. And Israel gives parents choice, understanding that parents probably know better than education bureaucrats what's going to work. Last question?
Yeah, one last question we have time for. Yeah.
I have a question or 2 questions.
Try
First
one.
off, good evening, Mr. Medved. I've been watching your podcast for a while. Do you think that that we should learn about socialism and communism at schools to show which is right and which is wrong? And do you think that this country should unionize?
Okay, what was the second question?
Do you think this country should unionize?
Do I think this country should be unionized or is unionized?
Should be.
Oh, okay, and there was one last question over here. I'll take that at the same time and then answer both quickly. Can the lady here? Yes, thank you. I saw your hand up.
When you were talking about the blessings of the Jewish people and those who bless Israel will be blessed. Is it in your book at all when you talked about the letter that George Washington wrote to the rabbi up in Newport, Rhode Island?
No, it's of the Truro Synagogue. Not only is that there, but there's another George Washington letter that he wrote to the Jewish congregation in Savannah, Georgia. And again, yes, of course, it's remarkable. And do you know what James Madison's major was at Princeton? Hebrew. John Quincy Adams actually spoke Hebrew, which was very rare, and wrote and translated Hebrew so he could read the Bible. And he, like his father, was a Christian Zionist. And no, yes, that is there. In terms of your question, should people learn the truth about socialism and communism? Look, if the best accounting that has been done, which is a book by French scholars, and they're French scholars on the left, of the victims of communism are at least 100 million dead. Most of them Chinese, but many millions of them Russian, many of them Cuban, all around the world. Communism is a deadly force. Should children learn about that in school? They should, absolutely, but they should learn the truth. And I'm sorry, there's no way you can teach children the truth about World War II without talking about Nazism being evil. And there's no way you can teach children the truth about the Cold War without having the same kind of clear-sighted recognition about how evil and what a remarkable threat it is to the entire world, communism, that George Kennan had in the Long Telegram. And as I mentioned, I think that is that Long Telegram where it talks about America's duty to accept this challenge. I think that should be taught to children in school in all ways. You asked, should America be unionized? People, you don't get unionized from above. And the idea that somebody should make a decision, we want to be unionized, we want to be not unionized, I think that was one of the big mistakes of the Roosevelt era, was relying too much on trying to unionize from above. If people want to organize a union, they have a right to do it. If you want to pay the dues, if you want to get the pension, which sometimes can be pretty good, more power to you. But the idea that we should have a declaration, we need more people in unions, therefore we have to change policy. If more people found benefit in unions, they would join them. And I honestly believe that America has always worked best when decisions flow from the bottom up, not the top down. That's what Reagan's life and legacy was all about. Let me conclude on this. When he gave his farewell speech, which is one of the great speeches in American history, and he talked about people gathering around, talking around their own kitchen table, that's where real change happens in America. And by the way, that's where real change is going to happen, and completely turn away this idea of teaching people that America is evil. That is not going to stand. I am not confident about everything politically. I am very, very confident that unless the leaders of both political parties completely reject the insults and assaults and the trashing of America, this America-loving, flag-loving, patriotic country is going to reject whatever side takes that position. And as President Reagan would always affirm, it's a very bad idea to bet against the United States. We should have comfort, confidence that America's best days lie ahead. Sometimes it's kind of hard to believe it when you look around, but there have been shocks before, like morning in America. And now we have not just morning in America, but midday in America, and it should be a lovely day tomorrow and for all our tomorrows. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Please remain seated as our guest leaves the room and gets ready for the book signing. You may purchase your book right outside these doors or at the museum store. For this book signing, we will be doing something differently this time. We will be entering through our